The messenger arrived at dawn, his horse frothing at the mouth, its legs trembling from a journey that should have killed both rider and mount. He collapsed at the gates of Niani, Mali's capital, gasping a single word that would echo through history, Sosso. The guards carried him to the palace, where a young man named Sundiata Keita, who had learned to walk only years before after a childhood spent paralyzed, received news that would force him to become either a king or a corpse. His homeland had been invaded. His family had been slaughtered. An army led by a sorcerer who wore armor that couldn't be pierced was burning everything his ancestors had built, and he, an exile living in a foreign court, was Mali's only hope. This is how empires are born, not in moments of triumph, but in moments of desperation. But to understand why this moment mattered, we need to travel back 2 centuries earlier, to a time when the greatest empire in West Africa was dying and nobody knew what would replace it. The Ghana Empire, which had nothing to do with the modern country of Ghana, had dominated the Western Sahel for half a millennium. Their power came from a simple geographical fact. They sat between the gold mines to the south and the salt deposits to the north. Every caravan carrying gold toward the Mediterranean had to pass through Ghanaian territory. Every caravan bringing salt to the forest kingdoms had to pay Ghanaian taxes. The empire didn't mine the gold or extract the salt themselves. They simply controlled the roads, and that was enough. For 500 years, it was enough. Then everything fell apart at once. In 1076, Almoravid warriors from Morocco, driven by religious fervor and desire for wealth, conquered Ghana's capital. The blow was devastating but not immediately fatal. Empires can survive military defeat if their economic foundations remain solid. Ghana's problem was that those foundations were crumbling. The Sahara was expanding southward, driven by climate changes that nobody understood. Droughts withered farmlands that had fed cities for generations. The gold trade routes shifted as new kingdoms emerged in the forest regions. Tributary states that had paid taxes for centuries saw Ghana's weakness and stopped paying. By 1100, the Ghana Empire existed in name only. Its territory had fragmented into dozens of small kingdoms, each one scrambling to control whatever piece of the old trade networks they could grab. It was a dark age for West Africa, a time of uncertainty when nobody knew which kingdom would rise to fill the vacuum. Most people would have bet on Sosso. The Sosso kingdom, ruled by the Kanté clan, had been one of Ghana's most powerful tributaries. They controlled iron mines and had a reputation for producing the best weapons in the region. Their warriors were feared. Their blacksmiths were said to possess magical knowledge, the ability to forge metal that could cut through anything and armor that couldn't be pierced. When Sosso's king, Sumanguru Kanté, began conquering his neighbors in the early 13th century, it seemed inevitable that he would rebuild Ghana's empire under his own rule. Few would have bet on Kangaba. This small kingdom along the upper Niger River was neither the strongest nor the richest of Ghana's former tributaries. Its rulers, the Keita clan, claimed descent from Bilal ibn Rabah, the first muezzin of Islam and a companion of the Prophet Muhammad. This gave them religious prestige but not much else. They controlled some fertile farmland along the river and participated in regional trade, but they were minor players in the great game of West African politics. Everything changed because of a prophecy and a crippled child. The king of Kangaba, Nare Magan Konate, received a visit from hunters who moved between villages, men who existed on the boundary between the physical and spiritual worlds. These hunters brought a message. A son born to an ugly woman would become the greatest king the region had ever known. When a woman named Sogolon arrived at court, the other wives mocked her appearance. But Nare Magan remembered the prophecy and married her anyway. Their son was born around 1217. He couldn't walk. His legs wouldn't support his weight, whether from disease or birth defect, the sources don't specify. In a warrior society where physical strength determined status, this was catastrophic. The king had other sons, strong boys who could ride horses and throw spears. Why would anyone follow a crippled child? Sogolon raised her son in the shadow of mockery. The other wives taunted her. Their children bullied young Sogolon Jata, as he was called then. The boy who was supposed to become a great king couldn't even stand without help. The prophecy seemed like a cruel joke. Then came the day that would become legend. The exact details vary depending on which griot tells the story, but the essence remains constant. Sogolon was denied access to leaves from the baobab tree, a staple food, by the other wives. This humiliation, being unable to feed her child because of his weakness, broke something open. Sogolon, Jata, 7 years old, called for an iron staff. 6 men struggled to bring it to him, a rod so heavy it seemed impossible that a child could even hold it. He planted the staff in the ground, wrapped both hands around it, and pulled himself up. The iron bent under his weight. His legs shook. The other children stopped laughing. The wives stopped mocking. And Sundiata Keita, for that would be his name from this day forward, stood. Within months, he was walking normally. Within years, he was hunting lions. By the time he reached manhood, he was the most accomplished warrior in Kangaba, skilled with spear and bow, respected by the soldiers, beloved by the common people. His father had died, and his half-brother Dankaran Tumen had inherited the throne. But everyone knew who the real power was. Dankaran Tumen knew it too, and he was terrified. The new king faced a choice: share power with his charismatic half-brother or eliminate him. Assassination was too risky. Sundiata was too popular, too well protected by loyal warriors. So Dankaran Tumen chose exile instead. He forced Sundiata to leave Kangaba, taking his mother and a small group of followers into the wilderness. It was meant to be a political death sentence. An exile had no power base, no resources, no way to threaten the throne. For most men, it would have been the end of the story. Sundiata spent years wandering between kingdoms, always welcomed because of his reputation as a warrior and leader, never able to return home. He lived in the kingdom of Mema, where the king recognized his talents and made him a general. He built relationships with other exiled nobles, with merchants who traveled the trade routes, with anyone who might someday be useful. He was patient. He was learning, and he was waiting. The opportunity came in the form of catastrophe. Sumanguru Kanté, the sorcerer king of Sosso, had been systematically conquering every kingdom in the region. His armies were unstoppable. His reputation for invincibility grew with each victory. In 1235, he turned his attention to Kangaba. The kingdom was small, weak, and ruled by the incompetent Dankaran Tumen. It should have been an easy conquest. It was. Sumanguru's army swept through Kangaba like a flood. Dankaran Tumen fled without fighting. Sumanguru captured the capital and did what conquerors do when they want to eliminate future threats. He killed the royal family. 12 princes were executed, their bodies left as a warning. The Keita dynasty was finished. Kangaba was now just another province in Sumanguru's growing empire, but Sumanguru made a fatal mistake. He knew that Sundiata existed, that there was one more member of the Keita royal family still alive. He chose to ignore it. An exile living hundreds of miles away, serving as a general in someone else's army, didn't seem like a threat worth worrying about. This miscalculation would cost him everything. Survivors from Kangaba made the long journey to Mema, carrying news of the massacre. They found Sundiata and fell to their knees, begging him to return and liberate their homeland. The griot Bala Faseke, who had been Sundiata's friend since childhood, and who Sumanguru had captured and forced to serve as his court musician, had managed to send messages. The people were ready to rebel. They were waiting for a leader. Sundiata looked at the messengers, at these desperate people who were asking him to fight an enemy who seemed invincible, who commanded sorcery and whose armor couldn't be pierced. He thought about his mother, who had endured mockery to raise him. He thought about his father's faith in the prophecy. He thought about his murdered brothers and the kingdom that should have been his. He said yes. What followed was not a simple military campaign but a political revolution. Sundiata understood that he couldn't defeat Sumanguru through force alone. Sosso's army was too large, too well-equipped, too experienced. Instead, Sundiata began building a coalition. He called on the kingdoms that had sheltered him during his exile, reminding them of their obligations and friendships. He reached out to clans and tribes who feared Sumanguru's expansion. He made promises about how a new empire would function, not through conquest and terror, but through mutual benefit and shared prosperity. Slowly, an army assembled. Warriors came from Mema, from Wagadu, from a dozen small kingdoms that saw Sundiata as their best hope against Sosso's domination. It wasn't the largest army in West Africa, but it was motivated by something more powerful than fear, hope for something better. The war lasted for years. It wasn't a single campaign but a series of battles, sieges, and skirmishes across the Western Sahel. Sumanguru won many of these encounters. His forces were more experienced, his tactics more refined. But Sundiata kept coming back, kept rebuilding his forces, kept adding new allies to his coalition. He was fighting a different kind of war, one where survival itself was a form of victory. The decisive confrontation came in 1235 at a place called Kirina. The location is lost to history now, somewhere in the grasslands between the Niger River and the mountains. Both armies knew this would be the final battle. If Sundiata won, he would control the region. If Sumanguru won, the rebellion would be crushed forever. The oral traditions preserved by griots transformed this battle into mythic confrontation. They say that Sumanguru's sorcery made him invincible, that arrows bounced off his skin and swords shattered against his armor. They say that Sundiata discovered the secret of Sumanguru's power through his griot Bala Fasake, who had learned it while serving in Sumanguru's court. The sorcerer king could be harmed by only one thing: an arrow tipped with the spur of a white rooster. Whether this was literal truth or metaphorical representation of discovering a tactical weakness doesn't matter for our purposes. What matters is that Sundiata found a way to defeat an enemy who seemed unbeatable. The battle raged across the plain. Sumanguru's forces initially had the advantage, their disciplined formations pushing back Sundiata's coalition. But at the critical moment, something changed. An arrow struck Sumanguru. He cried out, not in pain, the griots say, but in shock that he could be wounded at all. His invincibility was broken. His power was revealed as illusion. Sumanguru fled the battlefield, riding away from Karina as his army collapsed around him. Some traditions say he vanished into a cave in the Kulikoro Mountains and was never seen again. Others claim he died from his wounds while trying to escape. A few say he lived out his days as a broken man in a distant village, stripped of power and magic. The truth doesn't matter as much as the consequence. Sumanguru's empire died with his departure from that battlefield. His generals surrendered or fled. His tributaries declared independence, and Sundiata Keita, the boy who couldn't walk, became the master of West Africa. But here's what made Sundiata's victory historically significant: what he did next. Most conquerors would have simply declared themselves emperor and ruled through military force. Sundiata did something revolutionary instead. He called a gathering at Kuruken Fuga, a place whose exact location is also lost to history, but which was probably near his capital. Representatives came from all the clans, kingdoms, and tribes that had supported him. Together, they created a charter, a set of laws and principles that would govern the new Mali Empire. The Kuruken Fuga Charter, preserved through oral tradition and only written down in the 20th century, was remarkably sophisticated for its time. It divided society into specific clans with designated roles. Some would provide warriors, others would be traders, others would be griots who preserved history and served as advisors. It established rules for inheritance and succession. It created protections for certain classes of people. It outlawed some forms of slavery while regulating others. It included environmental provisions, protecting specific trees and animals. It even established something resembling women's rights, granting women certain property and inheritance protections unusual for the 13th century. Most importantly, the charter created a federal system where power was distributed among different groups. The Keita clan would provide the emperor, but they didn't have absolute authority. Other clans had specific responsibilities and privileges that the emperor couldn't simply override. Provincial governors had significant autonomy as long as they paid taxes and maintained order. Local customs were respected as long as they didn't conflict with the empire's core principles. This system worked because everyone had a stake in maintaining it. The empire wasn't built on conquest alone, but on a complex web of mutual obligations and shared interests. This made it stable in ways that purely military empires weren't. Under Sundiata's rule, Mali expanded rapidly. He controlled the gold fields of Bambouk and Bure, the richest deposits in West Africa. He controlled the salt mines of Tagaza in the Sahara, where slabs of salt were cut from the ground and carried south to regions where salt was literally worth its weight in gold. He controlled the Niger River, the highway that connected the Sahel to the forest kingdoms of the south. Every caravan that moved through this territory paid taxes to Mali. Every merchant who traded in Mali's cities enriched the empire. The gold trade was particularly lucrative. West African gold had been flowing north across the Sahara for centuries, but Mali systematized and expanded this commerce. The exact locations of the gold mines remained secret. The miners had no interest in letting outsiders know where the wealth originated. But Mali's emperors controlled the trade routes and the markets where gold was exchanged. They took a percentage of every transaction. They ensured security so that merchants could travel safely. They maintained the infrastructure of wells, caravanserais, and way stations that made Saharan crossings possible. This gold financed everything else. It paid for the army that protected the empire's borders. It supported the administration that governed hundreds of thousands of square miles of territory. It funded the construction of mosques, schools, and palaces. It attracted scholars, merchants, and artisans from across the Islamic world. Mali's gold made the empire not just wealthy, but culturally vibrant. Sundiata ruled for approximately 20 years before his death around 1255. The circumstances remain unclear. Some sources claim he died peacefully, others that he was killed accidentally during a celebration, still others that he drowned. What's certain is that he left behind an empire that was stable, prosperous, and positioned to become one of the medieval world's great powers. His successors would build on this foundation, but it would take another 50 years and a different kind of emperor to make Mali famous throughout the world. Mansa Musa was born around 1280 into a royal family that had grown comfortable with power. He wasn't Sundiata's direct descendant, but belonged to the same Keita clan. He came to the throne in 1312 under unusual circumstances. The previous emperor, Mansa Abubakari II, had become obsessed with exploration. He wanted to know what lay across the Atlantic Ocean. According to accounts preserved by Arab historians, Abubakari II commissioned a fleet of ships, appointed Musa as his deputy, and sailed west into the Atlantic. He never returned. After waiting a reasonable period to confirm that the emperor was truly gone, Musa took the throne. He inherited an empire at its peak, wealthy, stable, controlling the most valuable trade routes in Africa. What he did with this inheritance would make him the most famous African ruler of the medieval period. Mansa Musa was devout. Islam had been Mali's official religion since Sundiata's time, though traditional African religious practices remained widespread among common people. For Musa, faith wasn't just personal belief but public duty. And one of Islam's 5 pillars was the Hajj, the pilgrimage to Mecca that every Muslim who was physically and financially able should make at least once in their lifetime. In 1324, Mansa Musa decided to make his pilgrimage, and he decided to do it in a way that would announce Mali's wealth and power to the entire Islamic world. The caravan that departed from Mali in 1324 was designed to be unforgettable. The numbers vary depending on which historical source you trust, but the most commonly cited figures are staggering. 60,000 people accompanied Mansa Musa on his journey. This included soldiers for protection, administrators to handle logistics, servants, enslaved people, merchants hoping to profit from the journey, scholars seeking to study in the Middle East, and members of the royal court. 12,000 enslaved people each carried 4 pounds of gold bars. Let that sink in. 12,000 people each carrying 4 pounds of gold. That's 48,000 pounds of gold just in what the slaves carried. Then there were the camels. Sources mention 80 to 100 camels, each loaded with 300 pounds of gold dust. That's an additional 24,000 to 30,000 pounds of gold. In total, the caravan was transporting somewhere around 70 to 80,000 pounds of gold. At today's prices, that would be worth over $1 billion. But in the medieval economy, where gold was rarer and more crucial to the monetary system, the real value was even higher. The caravan traveled north through the Sahara, following routes that merchants had used for centuries. The journey from Mali to Cairo took months, crossing some of the most inhospitable terrain on earth. But Mansa Musa's caravan was so large, so well supplied, and so wealthy that the desert was merely an inconvenience rather than a deadly threat. Along the way, they stopped in every major city. And in every major city, Mansa Musa distributed gold with a generosity that bordered on recklessness. The real impact became clear in Cairo. The Egyptian capital was one of the largest cities in the world, the center of the Mamluk Sultanate, a place that had seen wealth and power from across the Islamic world. The Mamluks thought they understood what it meant to be rich. Then Mansa Musa arrived. The emperor entered Cairo in July 1324 with a procession that stunned observers. He rode beneath parasols of crimson and gold, wearing silk robes so fine they seemed to shimmer in the sunlight. His soldiers marched in formation, their weapons gleaming. The camels laden with gold stretched back as far as anyone could see. The sound of drums and horns announced his presence. This wasn't just a religious pilgrimage, it was a statement. Mali was a great power, and the world needed to recognize it. Mansa Musa stayed in Cairo for 3 months. During that time, he gave away gold to everyone. He gave to the poor in the streets. He gave to scholars at Al-Azhar University. He gave to government officials. He commissioned repairs to mosques and schools. He purchased supplies for his caravan. He paid for everything in gold, and he paid generously. Contemporary observers were amazed and then alarmed. Al-Umari, an Arab historian who interviewed people who witnessed the visit, wrote that Mansa Musa gave away so much gold that its value in Cairo dropped by approximately 20%. The gold market didn't recover for more than a decade. Think about what this means. One person, on one visit, distributed enough gold to cause measurable, long-lasting inflation in one of the world's major economies. Merchants who had been wealthy found their savings worth less. The price of goods increased as more gold chased the same amount of merchandise. The entire economic system of Cairo was disrupted because an African emperor was too generous. Mansa Musa apparently realized his mistake. On his return journey through Cairo, he had to borrow money because he'd given away too much. Even his borrowing was legendary. The amounts were so large that they became stories themselves. The loans helped stabilize Cairo's gold market somewhat, but the damage was done. For the next generation, people in Cairo would remember the year when the Black Emperor from Mali crashed their economy with generosity. From Cairo, the caravan continued to Mecca. Mansa Musa performed all the rituals of the Hajj, praying at the Kaaba, visiting the holy sites, participating in the ceremonies that connected him to Muslims around the world. He met scholars from Persia, India, and Spain. He discussed theology with learned men from across the Islamic world. He established Mali's place not as some peripheral kingdom, but as a legitimate member of the global Muslim community. He also recruited talent. Mansa Musa brought back architects, scholars, poets, and artisans to Mali. The most famous was Abu Ishaq al-Sahili, a poet and architect from Granada in Islamic Spain. Al-Sahili would revolutionize Mali's architecture, introducing building techniques from the Mediterranean world and creating a distinctive style that blended Islamic and West African traditions. When Mansa Musa returned to Mali in 1325, he'd accomplished something unprecedented. He'd made his empire famous throughout the Islamic world, and even in Christian Europe. Before his pilgrimage, Mali was known to geographers but remained somewhat mysterious. After his pilgrimage, Mali became the African empire that everyone had heard about. European mapmakers began including a figure of a black king holding a gold nugget in West Africa, labeled Mansa Musa, Lord of the Negroes of Guinea. For medieval Europeans, who had almost no direct contact with sub-Saharan Africa, Mansa Musa became the personification of African wealth. He was proof that Africa wasn't just a source of gold and slaves, but home to sophisticated civilizations led by powerful rulers. But Mansa Musa's most important legacy wasn't the spectacle of his pilgrimage. It was what he built with Mali's wealth. Timbuktu had existed as a small trading post for decades, situated at the perfect location where the Niger River bent closest to the Saharan trade routes. Goods from the south, transported by boat, could be transferred to camels for the journey north. Goods from the north could be loaded onto boats for distribution throughout the river system. Geography made Timbuktu important. Mansa Musa made it magnificent. He commissioned the Djinguereber Mosque, designed by al-Sahili using techniques from Islamic Spain. The mosque became one of West Africa's most important religious buildings, a place where scholars gathered to study and debate. The Sankore Mosque followed, then the Sidi Yahya Mosque. These weren't just places of worship. They were universities. The University of Sankore became particularly renowned. Students came from across West Africa and the broader Islamic world to study there. The curriculum was comprehensive: Islamic law and theology, obviously, but also mathematics, astronomy, logic, rhetoric, medicine, and history. The library holdings were extensive. Scholars wrote original works and commentaries on classical texts. Timbuktu developed a thriving book trade, with manuscripts sometimes worth more than gold by weight. This intellectual flourishing wasn't limited to Timbuktu. Djenné, an older city on an inland delta of the Niger River, had its own scholarly tradition that Mansa Musa supported and expanded. Gao, which Mali would conquer from the Songhai people, developed centers of learning. Across Mali's major cities, education became a priority funded by the empire's gold revenues. The manuscripts produced in these centers are remarkable. Hundreds of thousands of them were written or copied during Mali's height and in the centuries after. They cover every subject imaginable within the medieval Islamic intellectual tradition. There are Quranic commentaries and legal treatises, mathematical texts and astronomical observations, medical manuals and historical chronicles, poetry, and philosophy. What makes these manuscripts particularly valuable is that they represent a distinct intellectual tradition, not just copies of Middle Eastern texts. West African scholars engaged critically with ideas from across the Islamic world, developing their own arguments and addressing questions specific to their context. They wrote about how Islamic law should apply to traditional African customs. They made astronomical observations from West African latitudes. They chronicled local history while connecting it to broader Islamic narratives. These manuscripts survived in private libraries and mosque collections for centuries. Many are now housed in institutions like the Ahmed Baba Institute in Timbuktu, though the collection has been threatened by conflict, climate change, and neglect. During the 2012 occupation of Timbuktu by militant groups, many manuscripts were destroyed. But local people risked their lives to protect thousands more, smuggling them out of the city in trunks and suitcases. This act of cultural preservation demonstrated that Mali's intellectual legacy still matters deeply. Mansa Musa ruled for 25 years after returning from Mecca, dying around 1337. His son Mansa Magan inherited the throne but ruled only 4 years before his death. The succession then passed to Mansa Suleiman, Musa's brother, who ruled from 1341 to 1360. Suleiman maintained the empire's prosperity and continued supporting scholarship and trade. It was during Suleiman's reign that Ibn Battuta visited Mali. The Moroccan scholar had spent decades traveling through the Islamic world, visiting India, China, Southeast Asia, and East Africa. He was possibly the most widely traveled person of his age. In 1352, he arrived in Mali, and his account provides an invaluable outsider's perspective on the empire at its height. Ibn Battuta was impressed by Mali's security. He noted that travelers could move through the empire without fear of theft or violence, a remarkable achievement in an age when banditry was common everywhere. He described the efficiency of the postal system, where messages traveled rapidly across vast distances using relay runners. He was amazed by the discipline of the royal court, where subjects showed elaborate respect to the emperor. But Ibn Battuta also had criticisms. He thought some customs were un-Islamic, particularly the way women dressed and moved freely in public. He was scandalized by the persistence of traditional African religious practices alongside Islam. He found the food bland compared to the cuisine he'd enjoyed elsewhere. His complaints reveal as much about his own prejudices as about Mali's society, but they also provide authentic details about daily life in the empire. What's most valuable about Ibn Battuta's account is the specificity. He describes the layout of cities, the organization of markets, the procedures of the royal court, the behavior of officials. He provides names, dates, and specific incidents. Without his testimony, our understanding of 14th century Mali would be much poorer. Ibn Battuta confirms what other sources suggest. Mali was wealthy, stable, and well-governed. The empire's economy was diverse. Gold was crucial, obviously, but agriculture was equally important. The Niger River Valley was extraordinarily fertile, producing multiple harvests annually in some areas. Rice, millet, sorghum, and various vegetables fed the population. Fishing was a major industry. Livestock provided meat, milk, and leather. Trade extended in every direction. Caravans carried gold, ivory, and enslaved people north across the Sahara to North Africa, and from there to Europe and the Middle East. In return, they brought back salt, cloth, horses, books, and manufactured goods. To the south, Mali traded with forest kingdoms, exchanging salt and manufactured goods for gold, cola nuts, and more enslaved people. River trade connected Mali's cities to distant regions east and west. The slave trade was fundamental to Mali's economy, and we need to confront this directly. Thousands of people were enslaved through warfare, debt, or being born into enslaved families. They worked in agriculture, mining, domestic service, and as soldiers, enslaved people were exported across the Sahara, generating significant revenue. The nature of this slavery varied. Some enslaved people were treated relatively well and could rise to positions of responsibility. Some could earn or purchase their freedom. Children of enslaved women and free men were often considered free. But other enslaved people, particularly those working in mines or on large estates, lived in harsh conditions with little hope of freedom. This complexity doesn't excuse slavery. It was still a system built on coercion and violence, but understanding how it actually worked is important for understanding Mali's society. After Mansa Suleiman's death in 1360, Mali's power began declining. The immediate cause was succession crisis. Suleiman's son was passed over for a distant relative, leading to conflict within the royal family. This internal division weakened central authority. External pressures mounted. To the east, the Songhai people began reasserting independence. Gao broke away from Mali's control in the 1370s, cutting Mali off from eastern trade routes. To the north, Berber groups in the Sahara became more aggressive. The Tuareg captured Timbuktu in 1433, a devastating blow to Mali's prestige and economy. To the west, the Wolof Empire and other coastal kingdoms grew stronger. To the south, Mosi raiders attacked Mali's provinces. But the real problem was internal. Mali's strength had come from its ability to unite diverse peoples under a system benefiting everyone. As central government weakened, provincial governors became more independent. They kept more tax revenue. They stopped sending troops to support the emperor. The federation Sundiata created began fragmenting. By the late 15th century, Mali controlled only a fraction of its former territory. The Songhai Empire, centered on Gao, had become the dominant power. Songhai's ruler, Sunni Ali, was a brilliant military leader who conquered Timbuktu and Jenne. When he died in 1492, his successor Muhammad Touré continued expanding, creating an empire that would eventually surpass Mali in size. Mali's emperors continued ruling from Niani, but they were now regional powers rather than continental ones. The gold trade continued, but much of it flowed through Songhai territory. The intellectual centers continued their work, but under new rulers. The final blow came in 1591 when a Moroccan army equipped with firearms crossed the Sahara and defeated the Songhai Empire. This marked a new era in West African history, where gunpowder weapons and European influence would play increasingly important roles. Mali, already weakened, became even more peripheral. By the 17th century, Mali existed only as a small kingdom along the upper Niger River, where it had started centuries earlier. The great empire was gone, and then something strange happened. Mali disappeared from history almost entirely. European explorers and colonizers in the 18th and 19th centuries had heard vague stories about wealthy African kingdoms, but they didn't connect these stories to any real place. When Europeans began colonizing West Africa in the late 19th century, they encountered Mali's remnants but didn't recognize them. The great cities were ruins, the manuscripts were scattered, the oral traditions were dismissed as mythology. It wasn't until the 20th century that historians began seriously reconstructing Mali's history. They combined Arabic sources like Ibn Battuta's account with oral traditions preserved by griots, archaeological evidence from sites like Niani and Timbuktu, and comparative analysis with other African societies. Slowly, the picture emerged of an empire that had been one of the largest and wealthiest in the medieval world. Why did Mali disappear from history? Part of the answer is that most written sources about Mali were in Arabic, and European historians for centuries didn't prioritize African history. Part is that Mali's power was based on trade networks that shifted over time, leaving few permanent monuments compared to empires that built massive stone structures. Part is that colonialism deliberately erased or diminished African achievements to justify European domination. But there's a deeper reason. Mali's story doesn't fit the narratives that dominated historical writing for centuries. It was an African empire that was wealthy, sophisticated, and powerful when Europeans were just emerging from their own medieval period. It was an Islamic empire that maintained traditional African customs. It was a federation that succeeded through cooperation rather than pure conquest. It challenges assumptions about what African societies were capable of before European contact. The legacy of Mali is profound, even if not widely recognized. The manuscripts preserved in Timbuktu and other cities are being digitized and studied, revealing the depth of West African intellectual life. Archaeological work is uncovering evidence of sophisticated urban planning, international trade, and technological innovation. The oral traditions maintained by griots are being recognized as valid historical sources. Modern Mali, the nation-state that took its name from the medieval empire, struggles with poverty and political instability, but the memory of the empire remains powerful. Mansa Musa is a national hero. Timbuktu, despite decades of conflict and environmental degradation, is still a symbol of African achievement. For the rest of the world, Mali's story offers something equally valuable. It's a reminder that human achievement isn't limited to one region or culture. It's evidence that Africa has a rich, complex history extending far beyond colonialism and the slave trade. It's proof that wealth and power in the medieval world weren't monopolized by Europe and Asia. The architectural legacy is visible in the distinctive Sudano-Sahelian style, characterized by mud brick construction with wooden beams protruding from walls. The Great Mosque of Jenne, rebuilt in 1907 following the original 13th century design, is the largest mud brick building in the world. This architectural style was perfectly adapted to the Sahel environment, providing insulation against heat while allowing for easy repairs and modifications. What can we learn from Mali today? Perhaps the most important lesson is about the danger of historical amnesia. An empire that was one of the wealthiest and most powerful in the world simply disappeared from global historical consciousness for centuries. This wasn't an accident. It happened because certain narratives were privileged over others, because certain sources were valued while others were dismissed, because the people who wrote history books had interests and biases. Recovering Mali's history requires work. It requires taking oral traditions seriously as historical sources. It requires learning Arabic to read the chronicles. It requires archaeological investigation. It requires challenging assumptions about what African societies were capable of. It requires admitting that the history we were taught was incomplete at best. But the effort is worthwhile because Mali's story changes how we understand world history. It demonstrates that wealth and power in the medieval world weren't concentrated only in Europe and Asia. It shows that Africa was integrated into global trade networks and intellectual exchanges. It proves that African societies developed sophisticated political systems, economic structures, and cultural achievements. Mali also offers lessons about empire itself. All empires face similar challenges: maintaining control over diverse populations, balancing central authority with local autonomy, sustaining economic growth, managing succession crises, adapting to changing circumstances. Mali's solutions were creative and often effective. Its failures were instructive. The environmental lessons are particularly relevant today. Mali's prosperity depended on climate stability and sustainable resource management. When climate shifted and resources were overexploited, the empire declined. Modern West Africa faces similar challenges, with climate change threatening agriculture, desertification expanding the Sahara, and resource conflicts destabilizing the region. The story of Mali is simply fascinating on its own terms. The image of Mansa Musa's golden caravan crossing the Sahara captures the imagination. The idea of Timbuktu as a city of scholars and books challenges stereotypes. The story of Sundiata rising from paralysis to found an empire is inherently dramatic. The tragedy is that these stories were almost lost. If not for a few Arab chroniclers, if not for the griots who maintained oral traditions, if not for modern historians who took African history seriously, Mali might have been forgotten entirely. Even now, most people know nothing about the empire. It's not taught in most schools. It doesn't appear in most world history textbooks. This needs to change. Mali's history belongs in the mainstream narrative of world history, not as a special topic or an afterthought, but as a central chapter in the story of human civilization. The empire's rise and fall, its achievements and failures, its complexity and contradictions, all of this deserves the same serious attention we give to European and Asian empires. The work of recovering and telling this history continues. New archaeological discoveries are being made. More manuscripts are being translated and studied. Oral traditions are being recorded before they're lost. Digital technologies are making sources more accessible. A new generation of historians, many of them African, are bringing fresh perspectives to old questions. But this work needs support and attention. It needs funding for archaeological expeditions and manuscript preservation. It needs academic positions for scholars who specialize in African history. It needs publishers willing to produce books that challenge conventional narratives. It needs teachers willing to expand their curricula beyond the usual European-centered story. It needs all of us to be curious enough to ask why we weren't taught about Mali in the first place. The richest empire that almost no one knows about is finally becoming known again. The story is emerging from centuries of neglect, piece by piece, source by source, discovery by discovery. It's a story of human achievement on a grand scale, of wealth and power, of culture and learning, of rise and fall. It's a story that changes how we understand the medieval world and Africa's place in it. And it's a story that's still being written, as modern scholars uncover new evidence and develop new interpretations, as communities in West Africa reclaim their heritage, as people around the world discover an empire they never knew existed. The story of Mali is not just about the past, it's about how we understand the past, how we tell the past, and what we choose to remember and forget. So the next time someone asks you about the richest person in history, tell them about Mansa Musa. Tell them about the golden caravan that crossed the Sahara. Tell them about Timbuktu's libraries and scholars. Tell them about Sundiata and the founding of an empire. Tell them about Mali, the empire that controlled half the world's gold and then disappeared from history. Because these stories matter, they change how we see the world and our place in it. They challenge us to question what we think we know and to seek out what we've been missing. They remind us that history is not a fixed set of facts, but an ongoing conversation about the past, shaped by who gets to tell the story. Mali's story is finally being told again. Make sure you're listening. Make sure you're sharing it. Make sure the richest empire that almost no one knows about becomes the empire that everyone knows. If you've made it this far, you're clearly someone who values deep historical knowledge and isn't satisfied with surface-level stories we're usually told. There's a whole world of African history waiting to be explored. The Kingdom of Aksum in Ethiopia, the Benin Empire in Nigeria, Great Zimbabwe, the Swahili Coast. Each of these civilizations has stories as compelling as Mali's, achievements as impressive, lessons as relevant. Subscribe so you don't miss them. Leave a comment telling me which aspect of Mali's history you found most surprising, or which other African empire you want to learn about next. Share this with someone who loves history, or someone who thinks they know history but might be missing crucial chapters. Together, we can make sure these stories are never forgotten again. The past is richer and more diverse than we've been taught. Let's discover it together. The Songhai Empire that succeeded Mali learned from some of these lessons. Songhai's rulers invested more heavily in direct control of territory rather than relying on tributary relationships. They built a more centralized bureaucracy. They developed a professional army with specialized units. They expanded agricultural production in the Niger River Valley to reduce dependence on trade revenue alone. But Songhai also repeated some of Mali's mistakes, particularly the over-reliance on controlling trade routes and the vulnerability to succession crises that plagued all hereditary monarchies. When a Moroccan army equipped with firearms crossed the Sahara in 1591 and defeated Songhai at the Battle of Tondibi, it marked the end of an era. The great Sahelian empires that had dominated West Africa for nearly a millennium were finished. Power would shift to coastal kingdoms that could trade directly with Europeans, who were arriving in increasing numbers with ships full of manufactured goods and an insatiable appetite for enslaved people and gold. The intellectual legacy of Mali deserves special attention because it's where the empire's influence lasted longest and where its recovery has been most dramatic. The manuscripts of Timbuktu are the most visible evidence of this legacy. These weren't just religious texts copied from Middle Eastern sources. They were original works of scholarship produced by West African intellectuals engaging with the full range of medieval Islamic learning. A 16th-century scholar named Ahmed Baba, who lived after Mali's political decline but within its cultural tradition, personally owned a library of 1,600 books. When Moroccan forces captured Timbuktu, they confiscated his library and took him prisoner to Morocco. His protest reveals the depth of Timbuktu's scholarly culture. He complained that his collection was among the smallest in the city, that many of his colleagues owned far more books. Imagine a city where a private library of 1,600 volumes was considered modest. These manuscripts covered subjects that would surprise anyone who thinks of medieval Africa as isolated or backward. There are mathematical texts using algebra and geometry to solve practical problems. There are astronomical tables calculating the positions of stars and planets for West African latitudes. There are medical treatises describing treatments for diseases common in the Sahel. There are historical chronicles preserving oral traditions alongside written records, creating a unique hybrid form of historical writing. The legal texts are particularly fascinating because they grapple with real problems facing a multi-ethnic, multi-religious empire. How should Islamic law apply to people who also practice traditional African religions? What rights do women have in inheritance and divorce? How should commercial disputes be resolved when traders come from different legal traditions? The scholars of Timbuktu and other Mali cities developed sophisticated answers to these questions, creating a distinct West African school of Islamic jurisprudence. During the 2012 occupation of Timbuktu by militant groups, the world watched in horror as these militants burned manuscripts and destroyed tombs of Muslim saints. The images of ancient books going up in flames seemed to confirm the worst fears, that Mali's intellectual heritage was being lost forever. But what many news reports missed was the heroic effort by local people to save the manuscripts. Families who had preserved these documents for generations smuggled them out of Timbuktu in trunks, suitcases, and even canoes. They hid them in villages, in private homes, anywhere the militants wouldn't find them. Abdelkader Haidara, a manuscript preservationist, organized a clandestine network that saved an estimated 350,000 manuscripts. These weren't professional archivists or trained historians. They were ordinary people who understood that these books represented something irreplaceable, a connection to a past that proved their ancestors' achievements. The architectural legacy is less well preserved, but equally significant. The Great Mosque of Djenné, rebuilt in 1907 following the original 13th century design, stands as the largest mud brick building in the world. Its distinctive style, the smooth mud walls, the wooden beams protruding like ribs, the conical towers reaching toward the sky, became iconic not just of Mali, but of West African architecture generally. This wasn't primitive construction. The builders understood sophisticated engineering principles. The mud brick provided thermal mass, keeping interiors cool during scorching days. The wooden beams served as permanent scaffolding, making annual repairs easier. The buildings were designed to be maintained and modified by the community, a form of architecture that required ongoing participation rather than just initial construction. Every year, the entire community of Djenné gathers to replaster the mosque, turning maintenance into a festival that reinforces social bonds. This architectural tradition spread throughout the Sahel, influencing construction from Senegal to Nigeria. The mosques of Timbuktu, though smaller than Djenné's, follow similar principles. Even today, new buildings in the region sometimes adopt elements of this style, creating visual continuity with the medieval past. When you see this architecture, you're seeing Mali's influence persisting across centuries. The political legacy is more contested. When modern African states were created during decolonization in the 1960s, leaders faced a crisis of legitimacy. The borders were arbitrary lines drawn by European colonizers. The governmental systems were inherited from colonial administrations. What made these new nations authentically African? Some leaders looked back to pre-colonial empires for answers. The modern nation of Mali, created in 1960, took its name from the medieval empire, claiming a direct connection to that glorious past. The first president, Modibo Keita, claimed descent from Sundiata's dynasty, though the genealogical evidence was questionable. The national symbols, the flag, the coat of arms, the currency, all referenced the medieval empire. This political use of history served important purposes. It provided a counter-narrative to colonial propaganda that had claimed Africa had no history worth studying. It gave people pride in their heritage. It demonstrated that Africans had built powerful states long before European contact. It suggested that independence wasn't a radical experiment, but a return to Africa's natural state. But this romanticization also created problems. It sometimes led to authoritarian leaders claiming they were restoring traditional African governance when they were really just consolidating personal power. It created ethnic tensions by privileging certain groups' historical claims over others. After all, the Mali Empire had been dominated by Mandinka people, but the modern nation includes dozens of ethnic groups. It encouraged simplistic narratives that ignored the complexity and contradictions of medieval empires. The challenge for modern historians is presenting Mali's history honestly. This means acknowledging that Mali was genuinely impressive, wealthy, sophisticated, culturally vibrant, while also recognizing its problems. The empire's wealth came partly from controlling trade, but also from slavery and exploitation of subject peoples. Its intellectual achievements were real, but literacy was limited to a small elite. Its political system was creative, but it ultimately failed to prevent fragmentation and decline. What can modern people learn from Mali? The environmental lessons are perhaps most urgent. Mali's prosperity depended on climate stability. The empire flourished during the medieval warm period, when the Sahel received more rainfall and the Sahara was slightly less expansive. When climate patterns shifted in the 14th century, becoming drier and more variable, Mali's agricultural base contracted. Trade routes became more dangerous as water sources dried up. The Sahara expanded southward, swallowing productive land. Modern West Africa faces even more severe climate challenges. The Sahara is expanding at an accelerating rate. Rainfall patterns are becoming more erratic. Lake Chad, which once covered an area larger than Lake Erie, has shrunk by 90% since the 1960s. Farmers and herders compete for diminishing resources, sometimes violently. These environmental pressures contribute to political instability, poverty, and migration. The medieval empire's experience offers both warnings and potential insights. Mali succeeded when it managed resources sustainably and maintained infrastructure like wells and irrigation systems. It declined when environmental stress combined with political fragmentation to create cascading failures. Modern West Africa needs similar attention to environmental management, but with the added challenge of rapid climate change caused by global industrial emissions. The economic lessons are equally relevant. Mali grew wealthy by controlling trade routes and taxing commerce. This created prosperity but also vulnerability. When trade routes shifted or political control weakened, revenue collapsed. Modern economies face similar challenges with globalization. Prosperity that depends on international trade and investment can evaporate quickly when global patterns shift. Diversification matters. Empires and nations that rely on single commodities or economic models are inherently fragile. Mali's dependence on gold trade meant that disruptions to that trade threatened everything. Modern resource-dependent economies from Venezuela to Nigeria face similar vulnerabilities. Building resilient economies requires multiple revenue sources, diverse industries, and systems that can adapt to changing circumstances. The historical lesson about amnesia is perhaps most profound. An empire that was one of the wealthiest and most powerful in the world simply vanished from global historical consciousness for centuries. This wasn't natural forgetting. It was systematic erasure driven by European colonialism's need to justify itself by claiming Africa had no civilization worth preserving. Recovering Mali's history required deliberate effort. Scholars had to take oral traditions seriously as historical sources, not dismiss them as mythology. They had to learn Arabic to read chronicles written by North African travelers. They had to excavate archaeological sites that had been neglected. They had to challenge assumptions about what African societies were capable of. They had to insist that African history deserved the same rigorous attention as European or Asian history. This work continues. New archaeological discoveries are being made regularly. More manuscripts are being translated and digitized. Oral traditions are being recorded before the last griots who remember them pass away. Digital technologies are making sources accessible to researchers worldwide. A new generation of historians, many of them African, are bringing fresh perspectives and asking new questions. But this work needs support. It needs funding for archaeological expeditions that can reveal how Mali's cities were organized and how its economy functioned. It needs resources for manuscript preservation before climate change, insects, and neglect destroy irreplaceable documents. It needs academic positions for scholars specializing in African history. It needs publishers willing to produce books that challenge conventional narratives. It needs teachers willing to expand curricula beyond the usual European-centered story. Most fundamentally, it needs curiosity. It needs people willing to ask why they weren't taught about Mali in school and what else might be missing from the history they learned. It needs people willing to seek out unfamiliar stories and sit with the discomfort of realizing how incomplete their education was. It needs people willing to share these stories, to insist that they matter, to demand that they be included in how we understand the human past. The richest empire that almost no one knows about is finally becoming known again. Piece by piece, source by source, discovery by discovery, the story is emerging from centuries of neglect. It's a story of human achievement on a grand scale, of wealth and power, of culture and learning, of rise and fall. It's a story that changes how we understand the medieval world and Africa's place in it. But more than that, it's a story that changes how we understand history itself. It reveals that the narratives we've been taught are incomplete, shaped by the interests and biases of those who controlled education and scholarship. It demonstrates that recovering hidden histories requires work, but that work is worthwhile because it gives us a fuller, richer, more accurate picture of the human past. Mali's story belongs to everyone. It belongs to West Africans reclaiming their heritage. It belongs to historians reconstructing the medieval world. It belongs to anyone interested in how societies rise and fall, how wealth is created and distributed, how culture flourishes and declines. It belongs to everyone who believes that understanding the past helps us navigate the present and imagine different futures. So the next time someone mentions the richest person in history, tell them about Mansa Musa and his golden caravan that crashed Cairo's economy. Tell them about Timbuktu's libraries, where scholars debated mathematics and astronomy. Tell them about Sundiata, who couldn't walk as a child but founded an empire. Tell them about Mali, the empire that controlled half the world's gold and then disappeared from history. Tell them that Africa has stories worth knowing, empires worth studying, and a history as rich and complex as anywhere else in the world. Tell them that the history they were taught in school was incomplete. Tell them that there are whole civilizations, entire chapters of human achievement, waiting to be discovered by anyone curious enough to look. Because these stories matter. They change how we see the world and our place in it. They challenge us to question what we think we know and seek out what we've been missing. They remind us that history isn't a fixed set of facts but an ongoing conversation about the past, shaped by who gets to tell the story and what they choose to emphasize. Mali's story is finally being told again, rescued from centuries of neglect and erasure. Make sure you're listening. Make sure you're sharing it. Make sure the richest empire that almost no one knows about becomes the empire that everyone knows. Because it deserves nothing less, and because understanding this history makes us all richer. If you've made it this far, you're clearly someone who values deep historical knowledge and isn't satisfied with the surface-level stories we're usually told. There's a whole world of African history waiting to be explored. The kingdom of Aksum in Ethiopia that minted its own coins and built massive stone monuments. The Benin Empire in Nigeria, whose bronze sculptures rival anything produced in Renaissance Europe. Great Zimbabwe, whose stone architecture baffled European colonizers, who couldn't believe Africans built it. The Swahili coast, whose city-states traded with China and India centuries before European contact. Each of these civilizations has stories as compelling as Mali's, achievements as impressive, and lessons as relevant. Subscribe so you don't miss when we explore them. Leave a comment telling me which aspect of Mali's history you found most surprising. Was it the wealth, the scholarship, the political sophistication, or something else? Tell me which other African empire you want to learn about next. Share this with someone who loves history or someone who thinks they know history but might be missing crucial chapters. Together, we can make sure these stories are never forgotten again. The past is richer and more diverse than we've been taught. Let's discover it together.